welcome back to another video. In this particular video, I'm going to be performing not just a psychoanalysis, but a psychoanalysis and a psychotherapy regarding prenatal meth syndrome. And this therapy session is in order to essentially create a healing in the child's aspect towards its mother. And the prenatal meth syndrome, in its essential understanding, it's basically fetal alcohol syndrome, except for children who were born of mothers who would smoke meth instead. And similar to fetal alcohol syndrome, you would see changes in essential facial structures and formulation of certain more dominant regions and others and so forth, which results in ultimately a then change in the person's facial structure. It creates a different appearance to their facial structure, if you get the point I'm trying to make. Now, in terms of the actual psychotherapy itself, the idea of the healing is getting to the root of the actual trauma, which in order to get to the root, I will then induce the psychotherapy now. Based on your childhood, would you say you could actively say you experienced what would seem normal childhood in your behavior? And based on said normal childhood behavior, would you say then that you had an easy time going from place to place to place in order to essentially make new friends? You might have had a tougher time at that particular point, because this is where the cognitive issues start arising. The more you age, the more you see the cognitive issues of said individuals start arising. And in the cognitive issues is in its logical and emotional intelligence, at which it stems its stimulus from. It has been overstimulated already within pregnancy towards one intelligence, which is the emotional intelligence, which is why we see in prenatal meth syndrome babies a more predominantly formed white matter within the prefrontal cortex, resulting in a more bulbous head. And due to this particular nature, we then see a change in the child's perception of not just its surroundings, but of space and time. Because in itself, it comes from an experience that comes from an altered experience of space and time, which it continuously experienced as it flowed through the mother system within the womb at that particular point. And so in understanding this particular thing, how does that make you feel as a child? To first realize the potential change in your perspective and the idea of looking towards in your own personal understanding, now that you've formulated a more logical understanding of the perspective of things, would you say that that makes you angry? And to which the child would say it has understood this a long time ago. But in its processing of its emotions, it picked up on pattern recognition that led back to the initial source, such as poor dental health, falling teeth, on and on and on, which from an early standpoint can result back to the idea behind drug use. And as the child then picks up upon this particular trait, it gets a particular point of stimulus, as known as the rule of threes. The first time is the initial incident, but then the second time it becomes a pattern recognition, and then the third time it becomes reality. And in the knowing of the rule of threes, you can now see that this particular child, which is a child of prenatal meth syndrome, has essentially built a personality, or not just its own personality, but you could say it has built essentially its complex intelligence regarding being able to recognize patterns. And the recognition of patterns, you could essentially say that in the rule of 1, 2, 3, the first time is the initial incident, the second time is the pattern recognition, and the third time becomes reality. Now, over the duration of your life as a child, how many times would you say you've had the ability to analyze the potential outcomes at which you would say you have analyzed that particular situation, resulting in all potential outcomes, resulting back to one particular conclusion? And this is where you need to let that breath go. Because this is the breath your own mother could not let go at that particular point, which was she could not choose life. She chose drugs over life. And in knowing this, you then see a change in your rewiring of your patterns in your life, which is the moment you can accept that. But now in the psychotherapy of the mother, you would say, well, what gives her the right? You might see it from a perspective of patterns yourself, which you are of a paternal logical standpoint of pattern recognition. And it's in itself, you recognize that the mother itself had a history of drug use and imprisonment on and on and on and on throughout its life, resulting in one particular notion. That leads back to the initial onset of the crystal, which is a moment you gain essentially a perspective above the said life. Hence why light travels through the crystal. Because essentially you're smoking a person's life away. And in smoking the life away of the person, you're essentially creating the end and the beginning portions of time at this exact same time in this experience, which at this particular notion, if you as a mother have smoked or induced methamphetamines during the pregnancy, you would then see that your child essentially has a continuous experience of space and time, which is here and now. And in its paternal or pattern recognition of its own analysis of here and now, which is all everywhere here and now, you would then see why this child has these particular cognitive issue developments, because it has essentially changed while you were essentially busy getting high rather than trying to be a mom at that point, especially during the pregnancy, while you already had a previous child at that particular time as well. And the cognitive pattern recognitions of the two particular children, we might see where the existential issues truly arise out of. Now, in terms of the overall pattern recognition of the overall story, which in itself is the story behind that little rock, that little crystal. As the mother smokes that rock, she feels this entire perception of focus as one sense known as here and now, all space and time here and now, which in itself is flowing through her system, which is entering the child's mentality. She's essentially already formulated the child's logical and emotional mind before the child is even born. And from this perspective, you can actively see all walks of man once again, because if you were to analyze the skull traits of children of either fetal alcohol syndrome, prenatal drug syndromes as well, create malformations within the cranium, which in itself create more bulb-like or lesser bulb-like structures within the cranium. And in this particular syndrome, you essentially create a either heightened or lesser state of consciousness, even at the point essentially of birth, because this child is continuously processing what stimulates the mind already within the pregnancy. The problem now is where the crystal closes in the experience, and you as a mother are left as an exposed drug addict during the pregnancy, and because of this, now your child has been able to essentially pull away from you. In the forgiveness aspect of things though, because of its emotional detachment, it doesn't have a feeling of anger towards you in this particular moment, which is why it is able to remain calm, as I explain the particular perspective, once again placing a crystal, which you may understand, in your drug addiction self. Now, in the fundamental notion behind the overall fundamental truth behind where is the root of the actual trauma, well, you would find the root of the trauma is that little rock itself, the crystal. Because in the crystal is the perception of light that changes. You gain a perspective change. You could essentially say it's almost as a person takes a step above and the rest now remain on a lower dominant state of what we would consider consciousness. But if a child is born already as a result of this particular experience, it does not understand its particular experience because it hasn't had the time to modulate its own understanding of why it has a different experience, which is now why you might see a particular detachment of the child towards you as a mother now, due to the fact that for, say, the length of the child's life, which is here it is now in therapy with you as a mother, because you're still trying to baby the child at that point based on its cognitive developmental issues that which you caused. And so now we need to change the healing, which in order to change the healing, we need to create a perception or perspective in the child. You know you are different, and you know you're never going to be what the rest call normal. But in your different self is a higher potential, which could exponentially grow from, as you would understand in your pattern recognition. And from this particular pattern recognition of exponential potential, you could see you have potential if you choose to channel this higher state of consciousness in a particular direction. You could either focus it in a negative direction, which in itself results into you pursuing the same addiction, which is the love of the mother you sought, which was a meth addict, and in the same sense you yourself were choosing a meth addict as a girlfriend at that particular time. And in that notion itself, you see how that is creating a destruction force in your life, the same way it did in your father's at that particular point. And now you see these patterns are changing, and you're gaining a logical perspective. You are gaining a heightened self above the complex, that which was above your heightened self, which was your mother. Because in understanding the wizard, essentially, the higher the wizard is in its perspective, the more it may control the said universe and the experience described by the said drug addict. And so now when you look at this perspective, you are gaining a perspective above where you began from, which is from the crystal. And in this pattern recognition, you need to see one particular truth. In the idea that you're not emotionally connected, you can fundamentally say that it's never going to change at that particular point. But in the understanding that because you're so logical, you understand everything to a deeper root, you could use that to your advantage and use that to do good in the world. And if we learn to channel that energy, we can actively really create a change based on the level of consciousness you yourself as an individual are able to process. It could revolutionize our entire understanding of everything at that particular point. And because of this, you've had to suffer your whole life. And based on this analysis, I would say you should be forgiven. Not to yourself, but you should forgive. You may never have as close of a relationship with the parent that which caused this particular issue. You may never have a emotional bonding even to either sexual partners as a result because of the lack of emotional connection you have as a result of where you learn to perceive love from, which in itself results as to why you are here now. And in knowing that, you just need to learn to process yourself by creating a perspective change, which in itself is the same thing that which the drug addicted self of the mother was addicted to. Creating a perspective change, the more she pursued the crystal, the more she believed she would change the perspective of controlling the universe. And in that same sense, in that same perspective, you may gain the same complex without the use of the substance. But now you may actively see you can use it for good rather than doing bad, because in your neurological rewiring, which you're actively refeeling within yourself, you truly feel a change in your heart of where the direction could go from here. It simply does the world you live within allow you to make that change. And essentially it's not up to the world to accept that. It's up to you.